The January blizzard had been raging across the Austrian countryside for 3 days, transforming the familiar roads between Vienna and the Bohemian border into a treacherous wilderness, where even the most experienced travelers could lose their way within minutes of leaving shelter. Prince Alexander Whitmore urged his stallion forward through the driving snow, his military training and years of campaign experience the only things keeping him oriented toward the hunting lodge that represented safety for both himself and his small escort. The year was 1848, and Europe stood on the precipice of revolution. Prince Alexander had been traveling incognito from the imperial court in Vienna, carrying dispatches that could not be trusted to ordinary couriers, when the storm had struck with unprecedented fury. Now, with visibility reduced to mere yards, and his horse's strength failing, he faced the very real possibility that duty to the crown would cost him his life in this frozen wasteland. It was then that he saw her, a dark shape against the white expanse, barely visible through the swirling snow but unmistakably human in form. She lay motionless beside what appeared to be the remains of an overturned carriage, its wreckage scattered across the road like the bones of some great beast that had been torn apart by the storm's fury. Prince Alexander dismounted immediately, his boots sinking deep into snow that had drifted to knee-height in the shelter of the wrecked vehicle. The woman, for he could see now that it was indeed a young lady of obvious quality, lay unconscious, or worse, her face pale as marble against the dark fur of her traveling cloak. "Miss," he called, dropping to his knees beside her still form and pulling off his gloves to check for signs of life. "Can you hear me?" Her skin was ice-cold to the touch, but he could detect the faintest pulse at her throat and the barely perceptible rise and fall of her chest that indicated life still flickered within her frozen form. She was perhaps 23 years of age, with delicate features that spoke of noble birth and a beauty that even unconsciousness and exposure could not diminish. "Sergeant Morrison," Prince Alexander called to his aide-de-camp, who was struggling through the snow toward the wreckage. "Prepare emergency shelter immediately. We have a survivor who requires immediate warming." "Yes, Your Highness," Morrison replied, his weathered face grim with understanding of how precarious the situation had become. "The lady appears in desperate condition." Prince Alexander gathered the unconscious woman into his arms, noting both her slight weight and the expensive quality of her clothing despite its current bedraggled state. Her dark hair had escaped its pins and hung in frozen strands around her face, while her lips held the blue tinge that warned of advanced hypothermia. "Hold fast," he murmured to her still form as he carried her toward the makeshift shelter Morrison was erecting against the wind. "You're safe now." But even as he spoke the words, Prince Alexander knew that safety was a relative concept in their current circumstances. The storm showed no signs of abating, their supplies were limited, and the hunting lodge he had been seeking might as well have been on the moon for all the chance they had of reaching it in these conditions. The shelter Morrison had constructed from their traveling equipment was crude but effective, a canvas pavilion anchored against the wind and warmed by a small brazier that threw dancing shadows on the walls. Prince Alexander laid the unconscious woman on his own sleeping furs, then began the delicate process of warming her frozen body without causing the shock that could prove fatal to someone in her condition. "Your Highness," Morrison said quietly, "I found these in the carriage wreckage." He handed over a leather portfolio that had somehow survived the accident, its contents protected by oiled cloth wrapping. Inside were traveling documents that revealed the unconscious woman's identity and circumstances. "Lady Evangeline Ashford," Prince Alexander read from the papers, "daughter of the Earl of Ashford, en route from Prague to Vienna under escort of the Imperial Guard." The revelation that she was traveling under official protection made her presence on this desolate road even more mysterious. The Imperial Guard did not lose their charges to carriage accidents, and they certainly did not abandon injured nobles in snowstorms. "Where are her escorts?" Morrison asked, voicing the question that had immediately occurred to his commander. "Missing," Prince Alexander replied grimly, scanning the documents for additional information. "Along with her maid, her luggage, and anything else of value that might have been in the carriage." The implication was clear and disturbing. Lady Evangeline had not been the victim of an accident, but of something far more sinister: robbery, kidnapping, or worse. Her survival was likely due only to the fact that she had been left for dead when the storm made pursuit or disposal of evidence seem unnecessary. "Bandits?" Morrison suggested. "Or something more sophisticated," Prince Alexander replied, his military mind analyzing the tactical aspects of what had occurred. "The Imperial Guard escort suggests this lady was carrying more than mere traveling funds, Someone wanted whatever she was transporting, and they were willing to commit murder to obtain it. As if summoned by their discussion of her circumstances, Lady Evangeline began to stir, her dark eyelashes fluttering against pale cheeks as consciousness slowly returned. Prince Alexander immediately moved to her side, his presence both protective and reassuring, as she struggled to make sense of her surroundings. "Where?" she whispered, her voice barely audible through lips still stiff with cold. "You're safe," Prince Alexander assured her gently, offering her a cup of warmed wine that Morrison had prepared. "You were injured in a carriage accident, but you're alive and protected now." Evangeline's violet eyes focused on his face with growing awareness, and Prince Alexander felt something shift in his chest at the intelligence and strength he saw reflected there. Even weakened by exposure and trauma, this woman possessed a presence that commanded attention and respect. "The papers," she said urgently, trying to sit up despite her obvious weakness. "Were the papers taken?" "What papers?" Prince Alexander asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "The correspondence I was carrying for Count Metternich," she replied, her voice growing stronger with desperation. "Treaties, agreements, if they fall into the wrong hands, the consequences could be catastrophic." Prince Alexander exchanged glances with Morrison, both men understanding immediately that Lady Evangeline's accident was anything but coincidental. Someone had known she was carrying sensitive diplomatic correspondence and had arranged for its theft under cover of apparent highway robbery. "The papers are gone," he told her gently, "along with your escorts and everything else of value from the carriage." The news struck her like a physical blow, and tears began to flow down her cheeks, tears of guilt and despair rather than simple grief for her own circumstances. "I've failed," she whispered. "Count Metternich trusted me with documents that could prevent war between Austria and Prussia, and I've lost them to common thieves." "Not common thieves," Prince Alexander corrected grimly. "This was a sophisticated operation planned by someone with knowledge of your route and your cargo. You were betrayed by someone within the diplomatic service itself." The revelation seemed to penetrate her despair, replacing it with a different kind of concern. "If there's a traitor in Count Metternich's organization," she said with growing alarm, "then my failure to reach Vienna may be the least of our problems." Prince Alexander found himself impressed by her quick grasp of the political implications, even while weakened by exposure and trauma. Lady Evangeline Ashford was clearly more than a mere courier. She understood the documents she had been carrying and their significance to the delicate balance of European politics. "Lady Evangeline," he said carefully, "did you know the contents of the correspondence you were transporting?" "Every word," she replied without hesitation. "Count Metternich insisted that I memorize the essential details in case the physical documents were lost or damaged during travel." The admission changed everything. Lady Evangeline was not simply a victim of diplomatic theft. She was a living repository of information that enemies of the Austrian Empire would kill to obtain or prevent from reaching Vienna. "Then we face a more serious problem than simple document theft," Prince Alexander said grimly. "If your attackers learn that you survived and can reproduce the contents of those papers from memory, they will not rest until you are silenced permanently." As the implications of their situation became clear, both realized that the storm which had nearly killed Lady Evangeline might actually prove to be their salvation. As long as the blizzard continued, pursuit would be impossible, but once it cleared, they would become targets for enemies whose identity remained unknown, but whose determination would be absolute. Prince Alexander looked at the brave, intelligent woman, whose rescue had become far more complicated than a simple act of humanitarian assistance. Protecting her would require not just keeping her alive in the immediate crisis, but ensuring her safety long enough to deliver Count Metternich's crucial information to its intended destination. The question was whether his resources and skills would prove sufficient to protect someone who had become the most valuable and vulnerable person in the Austrian Empire. The storm's fury intensified as evening approached, but within their improvised shelter, Prince Alexander and Lady Evangeline began the delicate process of assessing both her physical condition and the magnitude of the political crisis they now faced together. The small brazier cast flickering light on her pale features as she slowly regained strength, though the violet shadows beneath her eyes spoke to trauma that went beyond mere exposure to the elements. "Lady Evangeline," Prince Alexander said gently, offering her another cup of warmed broth that Morrison had prepared from their emergency supplies, "can you tell me what you remember about the attack?" She accepted the broth gratefully, her hands still trembling slightly from cold and shock. We were perhaps 10 miles from the border crossing when riders appeared from the forest, she said, her voice growing steadier with each word. Captain Richter, my escort commander, immediately recognized them as Imperial Guard, so he ordered our driver to stop. Imperial Guard? Prince Alexander's expression sharpened with concern. You're certain? Absolutely. They wore proper uniforms, carried the correct identification, and knew the appropriate recognition signals. Evangeline's eyes darkened with the memory. Captain Richter had no reason to suspect deception until it was too late. The revelation that her attackers had been wearing Imperial Guard uniforms elevated the conspiracy from mere banditry to something approaching treason. Someone with access to official uniforms, documents, and recognition procedures had orchestrated Lady Evangeline's capture. What happened next? Prince Alexander asked. The false guards demanded to inspect my traveling documents, claiming they had received intelligence about revolutionary agents attempting to cross the border with forged papers. Evangeline's voice carried bitter anger at having been deceived so completely. When Captain Richter presented my diplomatic credentials, they declared them obvious forgeries and ordered me to submit to arrest. And Captain Richter's response? He drew his sword and called for his men to defend me, she replied with obvious respect for her murdered protector. The battle was fierce but brief. We were outnumbered 3-1, and they had the advantage of surprise. Prince Alexander felt rage building in his chest at the image of brave soldiers dying in defense of their charge while being betrayed by those who should have been their allies. The sophistication of the deception suggested planning that went far beyond opportunistic theft. How did you escape? He asked. I didn't, initially, Evangeline admitted. After the fighting ended, they searched through everything, my luggage, my papers, even my clothing, looking for the diplomatic correspondence. When they found the sealed portfolio, their leader seemed satisfied and ordered the carriage overturned to simulate an accident. But you survived the crash? I was unconscious when it happened, but I believe they thought I was already dead from a blow to the head during the initial assault. Evangeline touched a spot above her right temple where Prince Alexander could now see evidence of serious bruising. When I regained consciousness, the attackers were gone, and I found myself trapped beneath the carriage in the snow. The courage required to free herself from the wreckage while injured and disoriented impressed Prince Alexander deeply, but it also raised questions about how long she had been exposed to the elements before his arrival. How long were you unconscious in the snow? He asked with medical concern. I'm not certain, Evangeline replied honestly. The storm made it impossible to judge time accurately, but I remember thinking it was growing dark when I finally lost strength and collapsed beside the road. Prince Alexander exchanged worried glances with Morrison. If Lady Evangeline had been unconscious in the snow for several hours, the fact that she had survived at all was remarkable, but there could be lasting effects from such severe exposure. My lady, Morrison interjected respectfully, do you feel any numbness in your fingers or toes, any difficulty moving your limbs? Evangeline flexed her hands and feet experimentally, wincing at the pain, but managing full range of motion. Everything aches terribly, but I seem to be able to move normally. That's encouraging, Prince Alexander said with relief, but you'll need continued warmth and careful monitoring to ensure no permanent damage occurs. As if summoned by their discussion of her medical condition, Evangeline suddenly swayed where she sat, her face going even paler as delayed shock began to assert itself. Prince Alexander immediately moved to steady her, his arms coming around her shoulders with protective strength. Easy, he murmured. You're safe now. Let the fear work its way through your system. The simple human comfort of his embrace seemed to unlock emotions that Evangeline had been holding in check through sheer force of will. Tears began to flow as she finally allowed herself to acknowledge the full horror of what she had experienced. Captain Richter had 3 children, she whispered against Prince Alexander's chest. Sergeant Mueller was planning to marry his sweetheart next month. They died protecting me, and I couldn't even preserve the documents they gave their lives to defend. They died doing their duty honorably, Prince Alexander said firmly, and their sacrifice was not in vain if we can get you safely to Vienna with the information you carry in your memory. But what if I can't remember everything accurately? Evangeline asked with genuine anguish. What if crucial details have been lost or confused? The peace treaty between Austria and Prussia hangs on precise language and specific concessions. Prince Alexander gently tilted her chin up so he could meet her eyes directly. Lady Evangeline, Count Metternich chose you to memorize those documents because he trusted your intelligence and attention to detail. That trust was not misplaced. You will remember what needs to be remembered. His confidence seemed to provide some comfort, but Evangeline's expression remained troubled. Your Highness, there's something else you should know about the correspondence I was carrying. What? One of the documents contained intelligence about revolutionary movements, planning coordinated uprisings across multiple German states, she said quietly. If that information reaches the wrong people, it could trigger premature rebellions that would be easily crushed, destroying any hope of meaningful reform. The revelation added another layer of complexity to their situation. Lady Evangeline was carrying not just diplomatic secrets, but intelligence that could affect the lives of thousands of people seeking political change throughout the German Confederation. Do you know who might have access to your travel plans? Prince Alexander asked, his military mind focusing on the tactical aspects of the betrayal. Several people at Count Metternich's office knew my route and timing, Evangeline replied, but the detailed schedule was supposed to be restricted to my immediate escort and border crossing officials. Yet someone knew exactly where and when to intercept you, Prince Alexander observed grimly. Someone with access to classified information and the resources to organize a sophisticated deception. Before Evangeline could respond, Morrison's urgent voice cut through their conversation from the shelter's entrance. Your Highness, we have riders approaching through the storm, at least 6 horses moving with obvious purpose rather than seeking mere shelter. Prince Alexander immediately moved to the pavilion's opening, his hand instinctively checking the pistols he carried for personal protection. Through the driving snow, he could see torches moving in their direction with the steady advance of searchers who knew exactly what they were looking for. They found us, Evangeline whispered, her voice carrying the terror of someone who understood that her survival had been discovered by people with every reason to ensure her permanent silence. Morrison, prepare for immediate departure, Prince Alexander commanded. Emergency packing only. We leave everything that isn't essential for survival. Your Highness, Morrison replied with professional calm, the horses cannot travel safely in these conditions. Moving now would be suicidal. Staying here will be equally suicidal if those riders are who I suspect they are, Prince Alexander replied grimly. Lady Evangeline, can you ride? I can ride, she said with determination that impressed him even in their desperate circumstances. As the torches drew closer and voices became audible through the wind, Prince Alexander realized that their moment of decision had arrived. They could attempt escape through the blizzard and risk death from exposure, or they could remain in shelter and face certain death from enemies who had already proven their willingness to commit murder. Looking at Lady Evangeline's pale but resolute face, he made the choice that would determine both their fates. We run, he said simply. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, we run. As they prepared for a desperate flight through conditions that could easily prove fatal, both understood that they were no longer simply survivor and rescuer, but partners in a race that would test every resource they possessed while determining the fate of secrets that could reshape the political landscape of Europe. The unconscious woman Prince Alexander had taken in his arms had become someone whose survival would require every skill he had learned as both soldier and diplomat. The question now was whether love and determination would prove stronger than the forces arrayed against them. The escape through the blizzard was a nightmare of endurance and navigation that tested every skill Prince Alexander had acquired during years of military campaigning. With Lady Evangeline mounted behind him on his stallion, they fought their way through snow that seemed determined to claim them as the storm's final victims. Guided only by his instinctive sense of direction and the desperate knowledge that capture meant death for them both, Morrison rode point, his veterans' experience reading terrain and weather patterns, keeping them oriented toward sanctuary that seemed impossibly distant. Behind them, the glow of torches had vanished into the storm, though whether their pursuers had lost the trail or simply been defeated by the conditions remained unclear. How much farther? Evangeline called through chattering teeth. Her arms tightened around Prince Alexander's waist as she struggled to maintain her grip despite hands numbed by cold. Not much longer, he replied with more confidence than he felt. The truth was that they were navigating by instinct and hope, with no clear landmarks visible through the driving snow to confirm their position. It was Morrison who spotted the faint glow through the trees that indicated human habitation, a hunting lodge or woodsman's cottage that represented salvation if they could reach it before their horses collapsed from exhaustion, or they themselves succumbed to the cold that was slowly draining their strength. The building proved to be a substantial hunting lodge, clearly built to accommodate noble hunting parties during the autumn season, but apparently unoccupied in the depths of winter. Morrison forced the lock with professional efficiency, and they stumbled into blessed warmth that felt like a miraculous reprieve from the storm's fury. "Thank God," Evangeline whispered, as Prince Alexander helped her to a chair before the cold fireplace. "I thought we would die out there." "We're not safe yet," Prince Alexander reminded her grimly, as he worked to build a fire from wood stored beside the hearth. "Our pursuers will continue searching once the storm clears, and this lodge is too obvious a shelter to remain hidden for long." But the immediate priority was restoring warmth to their frozen bodies and assessing their situation with minds that could think clearly rather than merely react to crisis. As the fire began to cast welcome light and heat through the lodge's main room, both began to understand the magnitude of what they had survived. "Your Highness," Evangeline said quietly, "I need you to know that what you've done, risking your life to protect someone you've never met, goes far beyond any obligation of rank or duty." "Does it?" Prince Alexander asked, settling beside her chair as they both absorbed the fire's warmth. "I would argue that protecting someone who carries information vital to preventing war between European powers is exactly the kind of obligation my rank creates. But you didn't know about the documents when you first found me," Evangeline pointed out. "You risked everything to save someone you believed was simply another storm victim." The observation was accurate, and Prince Alexander found himself examining his own motivations more carefully. What had begun as simple humanitarian assistance had indeed evolved into something more personal, though he was not yet prepared to analyze exactly what that something might be. "Lady Evangeline," he said carefully, "in the past day, you've displayed courage, intelligence, and determination that would be remarkable in a seasoned diplomat or military officer. Your survival is valuable to the Empire, yes, but it's also valuable in its own right." The compliment brought color to her pale cheeks, but Evangeline's expression remained serious. "Your Highness, there's something about my mission that I haven't told you, something that makes my survival even more critical than you realize." "What haven't you told me?" Evangeline hesitated, clearly weighing whether to reveal information that had been classified at the highest levels of government. Finally, she made the decision to trust him completely. "Count Metternich didn't just send me to Vienna as a courier," she said quietly. "He sent me as his personal representative to negotiate directly with Prince Schwarzenberg about Austrian response to Prussian military preparations." The revelation struck Prince Alexander like a physical blow. If Lady Evangeline was authorized to negotiate on Count Metternich's behalf, then she wasn't merely carrying diplomatic correspondence. She was herself a diplomat with authority to commit the Austrian Empire to courses of action that could determine the fate of millions. "You're empowered to make treaties?" he asked with growing understanding of the stakes involved. "Within specific parameters, yes," Evangeline confirmed. The documents that were stolen contained not just intelligence and proposed agreements, but my formal credentials as Count Metternich's plenipotentiary representative. "Then the theft was even more devastating than we realized," Prince Alexander said grimly. "Whoever orchestrated your capture now possesses not just intelligence, but the ability to forge agreements in Austria's name." The implications were staggering. With Lady Evangeline's credentials and knowledge of the negotiation parameters, skilled forgers could create false treaties that would appear to have full Austrian authorization while actually serving enemy interests. "Unless," Evangeline said with growing hope, "I reach Vienna and alert Prince Schwarzenberg to the theft before any forged documents can be presented." "Which explains why our pursuers were so determined to prevent your survival," Prince Alexander observed. "Dead diplomats cannot expose forgeries or correct false intelligence." Their conversation was interrupted by Morrison's return from reconnoitering the lodge's surroundings. His expression was grim as he reported what he had discovered. "Your Highness, we have problems," he announced. "The storm is clearing faster than expected, and there are signs of recent activity around the lodge. Footprints, evidence of horses, marks indicating this location has been used as a way station recently." "Our pursuers?" Prince Alexander asked. "Possibly, or other travelers caught by the storm," Morrison replied. "But either way, we cannot remain here safely. This location is too well known and too easily reached once visibility improves." Prince Alexander studied the map Morrison had found among the lodge's supplies, his military training allowing him to analyze their tactical situation with professional objectivity. They were perhaps 15 miles from the nearest town with Imperial Guard garrison, but the route would take them through open country where pursuit would be both possible and deadly. "What are our alternatives?" Evangeline asked, understanding that her survival depended on decisions that required expertise she did not possess. "We can attempt to reach the garrison at Altenburg," Prince Alexander replied, pointing to their destination on the map. "But the journey will require crossing terrain that offers no concealment from mounted pursuit. Or we can attempt to circle around to the border crossing and seek protection from Imperial forces there," Morrison added. "But that route would take twice as long and carry us through territory where our enemies may have additional assets positioned." Evangeline studied both men's faces, reading in their expressions the professional assessment that their situation was perilous, regardless of which option they chose. "Is there a third alternative?" she asked. Prince Alexander was quiet for several moments, his mind working through possibilities that would require extraordinary risk but might offer their best chance of success. "There is," he said finally, "but it would require separating our party and placing all our hopes on a single desperate gamble." "What gamble?" Evangeline asked. "I continue toward Altenburg with Morrison, drawing pursuit away from you while you travel alone to the border crossing," Prince Alexander explained. "You're small enough to move through terrain that would be impossible for mounted men, and your diplomatic credentials would ensure protection once you reach Imperial forces." The plan was tactically sound, but emotionally unacceptable to both of them, though neither was prepared to admit why the thought of separation seemed worse than facing danger together. "Absolutely not," Evangeline said immediately. "I will not allow you to sacrifice yourself as a diversion for my escape, and I will not allow you to risk capture when your survival is essential to preventing war," Prince Alexander replied with equal firmness. Their argument was interrupted by sounds from outside the lodge that made all tactical debates irrelevant. The unmistakable noise of horses approaching through the forest, moving with the purposeful advance of searchers who had found their quarry. "They've found us," Morrison said grimly, moving immediately to extinguish the fire that had provided such welcome warmth. Prince Alexander drew his pistols and moved to a window that offered a view of the approach routes, his military training taking over completely as he assessed their defensive position. "6 riders," he reported, "moving to surround the lodge. Professional deployment. These are not mere bandits." Evangeline moved to join him at the window, her face pale but determined. "If we're going to face this together," she said quietly, "then I want you to know something." "What?" Prince Alexander asked, though his attention remained focused on the approaching threat. "What I feel for you has nothing to do with gratitude for my rescue," she said with quiet conviction. "In the past day, I've come to care for you in ways that I never expected and don't fully understand." The confession struck Prince Alexander with more force than enemy fire ever had, crystallizing feelings he had been struggling to acknowledge since first taking her unconscious form into his arms. "And I," he replied, "have discovered that some people are worth protecting, not because duty demands it, but because a world without them would be immeasurably poorer." As their enemies closed in around the lodge and their moment of decision arrived, both realized that whatever happened next, they would face it as partners who had found something precious in the midst of mortal danger. The unconscious woman Prince Alexander had rescued from the storm had become someone whose survival mattered to him more than his own, while the stranger who had saved her life had proven himself worthy of complete trust and deeper feelings than she had thought possible. Now they would discover whether love and determination could indeed triumph over enemies whose resources seemed overwhelming and whose commitment to their destruction appeared absolute. The siege of the hunting lodge lasted throughout the night, a deadly game of patience between trained killers who held every tactical advantage and 3 defenders whose only assets were determination, limited ammunition, and intimate knowledge of their enemy's ultimate objectives. Prince Alexander had positioned himself and Morrison at windows that commanded the lodge's primary approaches, while Lady Evangeline maintained watch on the rear exit that represented their only possible escape route. The attackers made no immediate assault, apparently content to wait for daylight and better visibility, before attempting to storm a position that could be defended effectively despite their numerical superiority. "They know we can't remain here indefinitely," Morrison observed during a brief lull in the intermittent gunfire that had characterized the early hours of the siege. "Our ammunition is limited. We have no food supplies, and sooner or later fatigue will compromise our defenses. But they also can't afford to let this drag on too long," Prince Alexander replied, checking his remaining powder and shot with the methodical care of an experienced soldier. "Every hour we remain alive increases the chance that Imperial patrols will investigate the gunfire and discover their operation." Evangeline listened to this tactical analysis with growing understanding of their precarious situation, but she was also becoming aware of something that might provide an alternative to simple defensive warfare. "Your Highness," she said quietly, "what if we're approaching this problem incorrectly?" "What do you mean?" Prince Alexander asked. "We're assuming that our enemies want to kill us to prevent the information I carry from reaching Vienna," Evangeline explained. "But what if their primary objective is to capture me alive so they can extract that information under controlled conditions?" The possibility had occurred to Prince Alexander, but he had dismissed it as too dangerous to consider. "Even if that's true," he said, "allowing yourself to be captured would be suicidal. Once they have the information, your continued existence becomes a liability they would eliminate immediately. Unless," Evangeline continued with growing conviction, "they believed the information they extracted was accurate when it was actually carefully crafted deception designed to mislead them completely." Morrison looked up from his position with growing interest in what Lady Evangeline was proposing. "My lady, are you suggesting you would voluntarily submit to capture in order to feed false intelligence to the enemy?" "I'm suggesting that someone who has memorized diplomatic correspondence might be able to create convincing forgeries that would serve Austrian interests while appearing to satisfy enemy requirements," Evangeline replied with quiet determination. Prince Alexander felt his blood run cold at the thought of Lady Evangeline placing herself in enemy hands, regardless of the strategic advantages such a plan might offer. "Absolutely not," he said firmly. "The risk is unacceptable, and the chances of successful deception are minimal against opponents sophisticated enough to have organized this entire operation. But the chances of all three of us surviving a direct assault are even more minimal," Evangeline pointed out. With logic he could not refute. "At least this way, the information would serve Austrian interests, even if I don't survive the attempt." Their debate was interrupted by a new voice calling from the forest, cultured, authoritative, and speaking accented German that identified the speaker as Prussian rather than Austrian. "Your Highness," the voice carried clearly through the winter air, "I believe we should discuss terms for a peaceful resolution to this unfortunate situation." Prince Alexander moved carefully to a window that would allow him to respond without exposing himself to sniper fire. "I am listening," he called back. "Excellent. I am Colonel Friedrich von Kluge of the Prussian General Staff, and I assure you that we have no desire to harm anyone unnecessarily. We simply require the return of certain documents that were improperly removed from their rightful owners." The claim that the stolen Austrian diplomatic correspondence belonged to Prussia was so audacious that Prince Alexander almost laughed despite their circumstances. "Colonel von Kluge," he replied, "I believe you are mistaken about the ownership of the materials in question. Austrian diplomatic correspondence belongs to Austria, regardless of who might find it convenient to possess." "Ah, but that is where you are wrong, Your Highness," von Kluge continued, with obvious satisfaction. "The documents in question were created through joint Austrian-Prussian negotiations, and therefore remain subject to Prussian oversight regarding their proper distribution." The explanation was sophisticated legal fiction, designed to provide justification for what amounted to theft and murder, but it also revealed important information about enemy capabilities and objectives. "Lady Evangeline," Prince Alexander said quietly, "does von Kluge's claim have any basis in fact? Were any of the documents you carried the result of joint negotiations?" "None," Evangeline replied firmly. "Everything I carried was purely Austrian diplomatic correspondence intended for Austrian officials. Von Kluge is fabricating legal justification for theft. Then we know we're dealing with Prussian intelligence agents rather than mere criminals," Prince Alexander concluded, "which means this operation has official backing and virtually unlimited resources." Before they could discuss the implications further, von Kluge's voice resumed his diplomatic offensive. "Your Highness, surely you understand that Lady Evangeline's safety is our primary concern. She has suffered trauma and exposure that require immediate medical attention. If you allow us to provide appropriate care, I give you my word as a Prussian officer that she will be treated with every courtesy due her rank." "Your word as a Prussian officer," Prince Alexander called back, "seems to carry little weight, given that you've already murdered an Imperial Guard escort in order to steal Austrian diplomatic correspondence. Regrettable misunderstandings during what was intended as a peaceful document recovery," von Kluge replied smoothly. "Violence occurred only when Captain Richter chose to resist lawful Prussian authority to inspect suspicious materials. The casual dismissal of brutal murder as regrettable misunderstanding revealed everything Prince Alexander needed to know about von Kluge's moral flexibility and the fate that would await Lady Evangeline if she fell into his hands. "Colonel von Kluge," Evangeline called out suddenly, her voice carrying clearly before Prince Alexander could stop her. "If your concern is truly for my welfare, perhaps we should discuss terms that address both your requirements and my safety." "Lady Evangeline," von Kluge's voice carried obvious pleasure at having direct contact with his primary objective. "How delightful to hear your voice. I was beginning to fear that you had suffered serious injury during your unfortunate experience." "I am well enough to discuss reasonable arrangements," Evangeline replied, ignoring Prince Alexander's urgent gestures for her to remain silent. "What exactly do you propose?" "Simply this, my lady. You accompany me to a secure location where you can rest and recover while we discuss the proper disposition of the materials you are carrying. Once we have reached mutual understanding, you will be free to continue your journey to Vienna." The offer was obviously false. Von Kluge had no intention of allowing Lady Evangeline to reach Vienna under any circumstances, but it provided insight into his tactical thinking and immediate objectives. "And my companions?" Evangeline asked. "Will be released unharmed once our business is concluded," von Kluge assured her with the smooth confidence of someone who had no intention of honoring any promises he might make. Prince Alexander had heard enough. Moving quickly to Lady Evangeline's position, he spoke urgently in a voice too low to carry beyond the lodge's walls. "You cannot seriously be considering accepting his terms," he said. "Von Kluge will torture you for information, forge whatever documents serve his purposes, and then kill you to prevent exposure of his operation." "I know," Evangeline replied quietly, "but I'm not planning to give him accurate information. Remember, I memorized those documents completely. I know exactly what kind of false intelligence would serve Austrian interests while appearing to satisfy Prussian requirements." "The risk is still too great," Prince Alexander insisted. "Even if you could successfully deceive them about the contents, you would not survive the process." "Perhaps," Evangeline acknowledged. "But if I don't take this chance, none of us will survive the next few hours, and Austria will lose both the intelligence and the opportunity to use it strategically." Before Prince Alexander could argue further, von Kluge's voice resumed its diplomatic pressure. "Lady Evangeline, I'm afraid time is becoming a factor in our negotiations. Dawn approaches and my superiors expect progress in resolving this situation. What is your decision?" Evangeline looked into Prince Alexander's eyes with an expression that held both love and absolute determination. "My decision," she said softly, "is to trust that the man who saved my life will find a way to save me again if my plan fails." Then before he could stop her, she called out to von Kluge, "Colonel, I accept your terms. I will accompany you voluntarily if you guarantee the safe release of my companions." "Excellent," von Kluge replied with satisfaction. "You may emerge from the lodge with your hands visible and approach my position slowly. Your safety is assured." Prince Alexander felt his world collapsing as he watched the woman he had come to love prepare to sacrifice herself for what she believed was the greater good. But as Lady Evangeline moved toward the lodge's front door, he made a decision that would test every skill he had acquired as both soldier and diplomat. If she was determined to place herself in enemy hands, then he would ensure that her sacrifice served its intended purpose while creating opportunities for rescue that von Kluge could never anticipate. The unconscious woman he had taken in his arms was about to become bait in a trap that would require perfect timing, absolute courage, and more luck than any operation had a right to expect. Lady Evangeline's emergence from the hunting lodge was conducted with theatrical precision, designed to convince Colonel von Kluge that his diplomatic victory was complete. She walked slowly through the snow, with her hands visible, every gesture calculated to project vulnerability and submission, while concealing the steel-hard determination that drove her toward what appeared to be certain death. Prince Alexander watched from the window with his heart in his throat, fighting every protective instinct that screamed at him to intervene before she reached the Prussian colonel's position. But he also understood that Lady Evangeline's plan, desperate as it was, represented their best chance of turning tactical defeat into strategic victory. "Your Highness," Morrison whispered urgently, "if we're going to attempt rescue, it must be now, before they move her to a more secure location." "Not yet," Prince Alexander replied grimly, his military training warring with his personal feelings as he watched the woman he loved place herself in mortal danger. Let them believe they've won. Our opportunity will come when their guard is down. Von Kluge emerged from the forest line with two subordinates, his Prussian uniform immaculate despite the night spent in outdoor conditions. He was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute obedience, his confidence evident in every gesture as he approached his prize. "Lady Evangeline," he said with elaborate courtesy, "how good of you to be reasonable about this unfortunate situation. I assure you that your cooperation will be remembered favorably in my official reports." "Colonel von Kluge," Evangeline replied with perfect composure, "I trust you will honor your agreement regarding my companion's safety." "Of course, my lady," von Kluge assured her with the smooth confidence of someone who had no intention of honoring any promises beyond immediate tactical necessity. German officers are men of their word. But even as he spoke the reassurances, von Kluge was signaling to subordinates positioned throughout the forest. Prince Alexander could see movement in the trees that indicated the Prussian force was larger than initially apparent, and that preparations were being made for actions that would contradict every promise their commander had offered. "Morrison," he said quietly, "how many do you count?" "At least 12, possibly more," Morrison replied, his veteran's eye reading the tactical situation with professional pessimism. "They have us surrounded completely." Through the window, Prince Alexander could see von Kluge beginning Lady Evangeline's interrogation immediately, apparently unwilling to risk the delay that would come with transporting her to another location. "Now then, my lady," von Kluge said with false gentleness, "perhaps you could clarify certain details about the correspondence you were carrying. My superiors are particularly interested in Austrian assessments of Prussian military preparations." "I'm afraid I don't understand," Evangeline replied with perfectly feigned confusion. "The documents were sealed, and Count Metternich instructed me never to examine their contents during transport." "Come now," von Kluge said with a smile that held no warmth. "Surely you don't expect me to believe that Count Metternich would send a courier across hostile territory without ensuring they understood the importance of their cargo. What were you told about the document's contents?" Prince Alexander felt admiration for Lady Evangeline's performance, despite his concern for her safety. She was projecting exactly the right combination of cooperation and ignorance to make von Kluge work for information while avoiding obvious deception. "Count Metternich said only that the documents concerned Austrian diplomatic relations with German states," she replied. "He emphasized that my role was transportation, not interpretation." Von Kluge's expression began to show signs of impatience with her apparent naivety. "Lady Evangeline, I believe you underestimate both my intelligence and the thoroughness of my information regarding your mission. You were not selected as a mere courier. You were chosen because of your proven ability to memorize complex diplomatic correspondence." The revelation that von Kluge knew about her memorization abilities struck like lightning, confirming that the betrayal of her mission had come from the highest levels of Austrian diplomatic service. Someone with access to Count Metternich's most sensitive planning had provided Prussia with detailed intelligence about Austrian operations. "Very well," Evangeline said with apparent resignation. "What specific information do you require?" "Excellent," von Kluge said with satisfaction. "Let us begin with Austrian military assessments of Prussian border fortifications. What intelligence did Count Metternich provide regarding our defensive preparations?" Prince Alexander listened with growing tension as Lady Evangeline began to provide what appeared to be detailed information about Austrian intelligence regarding Prussian military capabilities. But as her responses continued, he began to recognize the subtle alterations she was making, intelligence that would lead Prussian commanders to overestimate Austrian military preparations while underestimating Austrian knowledge of Prussian weaknesses. "Fascinating," von Kluge murmured as he recorded Lady Evangeline's fabricated intelligence. "And what of Austrian diplomatic overtures to French representatives? We have reason to believe Count Metternich has been negotiating secret agreements regarding mutual assistance pacts. The French negotiations were mentioned in correspondence I reviewed," Evangeline replied with apparent cooperation that masked careful deception. Count Metternich expressed confidence that French support could be secured for Austrian positions regarding German unification. Prince Alexander realized that Lady Evangeline was feeding von Kluge intelligence designed to convince Prussian leadership that Austria possessed stronger international support than actually existed, potentially causing them to delay aggressive actions while seeking additional allies. But her success in providing convincing false intelligence was creating its own danger. Von Kluge was clearly pleased with the information he was receiving, which meant he would soon begin to consider whether Lady Evangeline's continued existence represented an acceptable security risk. The moment of maximum danger arrived when von Kluge completed his initial interrogation and stepped aside to confer with his subordinates in voices too low to be overheard clearly. Prince Alexander could see weapons being checked and positions being adjusted in ways that suggested preparations for eliminating witnesses rather than honoring agreements about safe passage. "Morrison," he said with quiet urgency, "whatever we're going to do must happen immediately. Von Kluge has what he came for and he's preparing to ensure it remains secret." "What are your orders, Your Highness?" Morrison asked, his weathered face grim with understanding that their next few minutes would determine whether Lady Evangeline's sacrifice had any meaning beyond noble gesture. Prince Alexander studied the tactical situation with desperate intensity, looking for any weakness in the Prussian deployment that could be exploited by two men with limited ammunition against overwhelming odds. It was then that he noticed the careful positioning of von Kluge's men, professional deployment designed to prevent escape but perhaps vulnerable to an attack from an unexpected direction. "The roof," he said suddenly. "They're watching the doors and windows, but they're not expecting assault from above." "Your Highness," Morrison protested, "the risk of falling through rotted timbers is less than the risk of allowing Lady Evangeline to die for information that will be used to destroy everything she was trying to protect." Prince Alexander cut him off firmly. As von Kluge concluded his conference with his subordinates and began moving back toward Lady Evangeline with obvious intent to conclude their business permanently, Prince Alexander made his decision. "Morrison, prepare maximum noise and confusion from the front of the lodge," he ordered. "I'm going to attempt rescue from the roof. Give me 60 seconds, then create the largest distraction possible." "Your Highness, that's an order, Sergeant," Prince Alexander said with absolute authority. "Lady Evangeline risked her life to protect Austrian interests. The least we can do is ensure her sacrifice achieves its intended purpose." As Prince Alexander prepared for what would likely be a suicidal rescue attempt, he could hear von Kluge addressing Lady Evangeline with the false courtesy that preceded betrayal. "My lady, you have been most helpful in clarifying these important matters. I regret to inform you that security considerations require certain adjustments to our previous agreements." "What adjustments?" Evangeline asked, though her voice suggested she already understood what was coming. "I'm afraid your companions will not be released as promised," von Kluge said with mock regret, "and your own journey to Vienna must be permanently postponed." Prince Alexander heard the words that confirmed von Kluge's intention to murder all three of them, and felt rage building in his chest that eclipsed any fear about his own survival. The unconscious woman he had taken in his arms had become someone whose love made him stronger, braver, and more determined than he had ever been. If she was going to die for her principles, then he would die proving himself worthy of the trust she had placed in him. As Morrison prepared the diversion and von Kluge raised his pistol toward Lady Evangeline's heart, Prince Alexander launched himself from the lodge's roof toward a destiny that would be determined by courage, love, and whatever justice existed in a world that too often rewarded treachery over honor. Prince Alexander's assault from the hunting lodge's roof caught von Kluge's forces completely unprepared for attack from above, his military training and desperate determination combining to create chaos in their carefully organized ambush. He crashed into two Prussian soldiers with enough force to knock them unconscious while rolling toward Lady Evangeline's position with tactical precision that would have impressed his old commanding officers. Morrison's simultaneous frontal assault with their remaining ammunition created exactly the kind of confusion that allowed Prince Alexander to reach Lady Evangeline before von Kluge could recover from his surprise sufficiently to complete his intended execution. "Down!" Prince Alexander shouted, tackling Lady Evangeline behind the meager cover of a fallen log while drawing his pistols with fluid grace. The firefight that followed was brief but decisive, with Prince Alexander's superior marksmanship and Morrison's veteran's instincts overcoming numerical disadvantage through superior positioning and the element of surprise. Within minutes, 4 Prussian soldiers lay dead or wounded, while von Kluge himself had taken cover behind a large tree with obvious reluctance to expose himself to return fire. "Your Highness," von Kluge called out with anger, replacing his previous diplomatic courtesy. "This intervention merely delays the inevitable. You cannot escape, and your actions have forfeited any claim to honorable treatment as prisoners of war." Colonel von Klug, Prince Alexander replied while reloading his weapons with practiced efficiency. You forfeited any claim to honor when you murdered Imperial Guard soldiers under false pretenses. But even as they exchanged threats, Prince Alexander understood that their tactical situation remained precarious. Their ammunition was nearly exhausted, von Klug still commanded superior numbers, and rescue by Imperial forces remained uncertain despite the gunfire that should have been audible for considerable distances. It was Lady Evangeline who provided the solution to their seemingly impossible position. Colonel von Kluge, she called out with renewed composure, perhaps we should discuss the strategic implications of your operation's failure. What failure, my lady? Von Kluge replied, though his tone carried less confidence than his words. The failure, Evangeline said with quiet satisfaction, represented by the fact that the intelligence I provided was carefully crafted deception designed to mislead Prussian military planning. The revelation struck von Kluge like a physical blow. Impossible, he protested. The information was detailed, comprehensive, consistent with known Austrian capabilities, and completely false in every essential detail. Evangeline continued remorselessly. Colonel, you have spent considerable resources to obtain intelligence that will cause Prussian commanders to make strategic errors that serve Austrian interests perfectly. Prince Alexander felt admiration flooding through him as he realized the full scope of Lady Evangeline's deception. She had not merely provided false information, she had crafted lies so sophisticated that they would actively damage Prussian strategic planning while appearing to be valuable intelligence. Moreover, she continued, your operation has confirmed Austrian suspicions about Prussian intelligence capabilities and objectives. The intelligence I memorized included deliberately planted information designed to identify exactly the kind of operation you have conducted. The admission that her mission had been designed from the beginning to expose Prussian intelligence activities transformed von Kluge's apparent victory into comprehensive defeat. Not only had he failed to obtain useful intelligence, but he had revealed Prussian methods and capabilities to Austrian counterintelligence services. This is impossible, von Kluge said, though his voice now carried the uncertainty of someone who was beginning to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. Actually, came a new voice from the forest, it's quite possible and highly effective. Through the trees emerged a patrol of Austrian Imperial Guard, their uniforms and equipment marking them as elite forces rather than ordinary border guards. At their head rode Captain von Habsburg, whose presence indicated involvement at the highest levels of Austrian military hierarchy. Colonel von Kluge, Captain von Habsburg announced with formal authority, you and your surviving men are under arrest for violation of Austrian territorial sovereignty and murder of Imperial Guard personnel. Von Kluge's face went white as he realized that his sophisticated operation had been anticipated and countered by Austrian intelligence services that had proven superior to his own. This is Austrian territory, he protested weakly. Prussian diplomatic representatives have immunity from arrest. You ceased to be a diplomatic representative when you began murdering Austrian soldiers, Captain von Habsburg replied coldly. You are now simply a criminal who will face justice for his crimes. As von Kluge and his surviving subordinates were taken into custody, Captain von Habsburg approached Prince Alexander and Lady Evangeline with obvious relief at finding them alive and apparently unharmed. Your Highness, Lady Evangeline, he said with respectful formality, Count Metternich sends his compliments and his apologies for the dangers you have faced in service to the Empire. Captain von Habsburg, Prince Alexander replied, helping Lady Evangeline to her feet with gentle care. Your timing was impeccable. Another few minutes and Colonel von Kluge might have realized the extent to which he had been deceived. Actually, Your Highness, Captain von Habsburg said with a slight smile, we have been monitoring this operation since before Lady Evangeline departed Prague. The intelligence about Prussian infiltration of our diplomatic service was accurate, and this mission was designed specifically to identify and eliminate the security breach. Lady Evangeline stared at him in amazement. Are you telling me that my entire mission was a counterintelligence operation? Your mission was exactly what you were told it was, Captain von Habsburg assured her. The correspondence you carried was genuine and important, but we also knew that Prussian agents would attempt to intercept it, and we prepared accordingly. The revelation that Austrian intelligence had anticipated and planned for von Kluge's operation added another layer to what had already become an extraordinarily complex situation. Lady Evangeline's courage in the face of mortal danger had been real, but it had also been part of a larger strategy designed to protect Austrian interests. "The false intelligence I provided," she said with growing understanding, "was prepared in advance as part of the operation?" "The framework was prepared," Captain von Habsburg confirmed, "but the specific content was left to your judgment and expertise. Count Metternich expressed complete confidence in your ability to provide deception that would serve Austrian interests while appearing credible to enemy agents." Prince Alexander felt profound relief that Lady Evangeline's ordeal had been part of a planned operation rather than simple accident, but he also felt admiration for the courage she had shown in executing her role despite genuine mortal peril. "Captain," he said, "what happens to Colonel von Klug and his operation now?" "Colonel von Klug will face trial for murder and espionage," Captain von Habsburg replied with satisfaction. "His operation's failure will force Prussian intelligence to reconsider their assessment of Austrian capabilities, while the false intelligence he obtained will influence Prussian strategic planning in ways that serve our interests." As they prepared for the journey back to Vienna under proper Imperial Guard protection, Lady Evangeline found herself alone with Prince Alexander for the first time since their ordeal began. "Your Highness," she said quietly, "I need you to know that everything I told you about my feelings was genuine, despite the complexities of my mission." "As was everything I told you," Prince Alexander replied, taking her hands in his with the same reverent care he had shown since first taking her unconscious form in his arms. "Lady Evangeline, what began as rescue has become something far more precious to me than duty or diplomatic success." "And what do we do now?" she asked, studying his face for signs of what their future might hold. "Now," Prince Alexander said with growing conviction, "we discover whether love that was forged in mortal danger can flourish in times of peace and prosperity." Their kiss was witnessed by Captain von Habsburg and his men, but none of the soldiers seemed surprised by this development. Love between people who had proven themselves worthy of each other was something that military men understood and respected. As their party began the journey toward Vienna, where Lady Evangeline would complete her diplomatic mission and Prince Alexander would report on his role in exposing Prussian intelligence operations, both understood that their real adventure was just beginning. The unconscious woman Prince Alexander had taken in his arms had become someone whose courage and intelligence matched his own, while the stranger who had saved her life had proven himself worthy of complete trust and deeper feelings than either had thought possible. Together, they had served their country's interests while discovering that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories began with someone being willing to risk everything to protect another person, even when that protection meant placing oneself in mortal danger. What had started as rescue had become partnership, what had begun as duty had become love, and what had appeared to be certain death had become the foundation for a life together that would serve both their personal happiness and their continued service to the causes they both believed were worth any sacrifice. 5 years after that bitter winter night, when Prince Alexander had found an unconscious woman in the Austrian snow, Princess Evangeline stood on the balcony of their Vienna residence, watching their 3-year-old son Charles play in the garden below, under the watchful eye of his governess. The spring afternoon was bright with promise, and the scene of domestic tranquility bore little resemblance to the life and death struggles that had brought them together. The diplomatic career that had nearly cost Lady Evangeline her life had evolved into a partnership with her husband that made them one of the most effective couples in European diplomatic circles. Their marriage had proven to be not just personally fulfilling, but professionally valuable, as their combined expertise in intelligence work and international relations had made them indispensable to Austrian foreign policy. "Mama," Charles called up from the garden, his voice carrying clearly through the mild air, "Papa says he has something important to show us when he comes home." "Does he indeed?" Evangeline replied, with the maternal amusement that had become one of her greatest joys. "I wonder what surprise your father has planned this time." Prince Alexander's surprises had become legendary in their household, carefully planned adventures that combined education with excitement, designed to prepare Charles for the complexities of the world he would inherit, while ensuring his childhood remained filled with wonder and security. Mrs. Morrison, their housekeeper, appeared on the balcony with the afternoon correspondence and news that would add another dimension to their family's ongoing adventures. "Your Highness," she announced with obvious pleasure, "there's a letter from Count Metternich requesting your immediate consultation on urgent diplomatic matters, and this package arrived from the German Confederation bearing official seals." The combination of urgent diplomatic business and official correspondence from German states suggested developments that would require the specialized expertise Evangeline and Alexander had developed over years of successfully managing complex international crises. "What does Count Metternich require?" Evangeline asked, breaking the seal on his letter with practiced efficiency. "Intelligence analysis regarding Prussian activities along the Bohemian border," she read aloud. "Reports of unusual troop movements and diplomatic contacts that suggest coordination with revolutionary elements in German states." The request was significant because it indicated that the intelligence networks they had helped establish following von Klug's failed operation were detecting activities that could threaten European stability once again. "And the German Confederation package?" she asked, turning her attention to the official correspondence. Inside was a formal invitation for Prince Alexander and Princess Evangeline to serve as Austrian representatives at a peace conference designed to address growing tensions between German states and their Austrian neighbors. "Frankfurt," Evangeline mused as she read the conference details. 3 weeks from today, full diplomatic immunity with authority to negotiate binding agreements on behalf of the Austrian Empire. The opportunity was both professionally exciting and personally challenging. Their expertise was clearly valued at the highest levels of international diplomacy, but accepting would mean separation from Charles during crucial weeks of his development. Their discussion of the diplomatic invitation was interrupted by Prince Alexander's arrival, still dressed in his military uniform from meetings at the Hofburg Palace that had apparently involved matters of considerable importance. "My dear," he said, embracing Evangeline with the same protective strength he had shown during their first desperate night together, "I see Count Metternich has already contacted you about the Bohemian situation. And we've received an invitation to Frankfurt that suggests our services are in considerable demand," Evangeline replied, showing him the conference documents. "Excellent timing," Alexander said with satisfaction. "I've just concluded discussions with the Emperor about Austrian diplomatic strategy regarding German unification movements. He specifically requested that we take the lead in representing Austrian interests at Frankfurt." The imperial confidence in their abilities was gratifying, but as they discussed the practical implications of the assignment, both were aware that diplomatic success would require the same courage and partnership that had characterized their most dangerous adventures. "Papa," Charles's voice drew their attention back to the garden, where the boy was attempting to demonstrate his improved climbing skills on the estate's ancient oak tree. "Look how high I can go." "Careful, young man," Alexander called down, with paternal concern, balanced by pride in his son's adventurous spirit. "Remember what we discussed about testing your limits gradually rather than all at once." The exchange reminded both parents that their most important responsibility was not to the Austrian Empire, but to the remarkable child whose confidence and curiosity reflected the security they had provided through years of devoted attention. "Alexander," Evangeline said quietly, "the Frankfurt conference will require at least a month away from home. Charles is at such a crucial stage of development. Can we justify such extended absence?" "We can justify it," Alexander replied thoughtfully, "because our work there will help ensure that the world Charles inherits is more stable and peaceful than the one we inherited. But you're right that the separation would be difficult for all of us." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar carriage bearing the insignia of Captain von Habsburg, now promoted to colonel and serving as chief of Austrian counterintelligence operations. "Unexpected visitors," Evangeline observed, as the colonel emerged from his carriage with the purposeful bearing that usually indicated urgent business. "Your Highnesses," Colonel von Habsburg announced as he was shown into their private sitting room, "I bring greetings from Count Metternich and news that may affect your Frankfurt assignment considerably." "What news?" Alexander asked, his military instincts immediately alert to potential complications. "Intelligence indicating that the same Prussian networks that organized von Kluge's operation 5 years ago are planning to disrupt the Frankfurt conference through systematic assassination of key diplomatic representatives," von Habsburg replied grimly. The revelation transformed their diplomatic assignment from prestigious opportunity to mortal danger once again. If Prussian agents were targeting Austrian diplomats, Prince Alexander and Princess Evangeline would be facing risks similar to those they had survived during their first adventure together. "Specific threats?" Evangeline asked, with the professional calm that had characterized her approach to dangerous situations since their first crisis. Intelligence suggests that your reputations as effective Austrian representatives have made you primary targets for elimination, von Habsburg confirmed. The same efficiency that makes you valuable to Austria makes you dangerous to Prussian objectives. Alexander and Evangeline exchanged glances that carried 5 years of shared understanding about duty, danger, and the responsibilities that came with their unique combination of skills and experience. "Colonel," Alexander said finally, "are you suggesting we decline the Frankfurt assignment due to security concerns?" "I'm suggesting that you accept it with full understanding of the risks involved and appropriate protection arrangements," von Habsburg replied. "The conference is too important to Austrian interest to send less qualified representatives simply to avoid danger." As they discussed the security arrangements that would be necessary for the Frankfurt mission, Charles appeared in the doorway with the fearless curiosity that characterized his approach to adult conversations he was supposed to be too young to understand. "Papa, Mama," he said with 3-year-old directness, "are you going on another adventure like the ones in the stories you tell me?" The question struck at the heart of their dilemma. Their son understood instinctively that his parents' work involved elements of danger and excitement, but he was too young to comprehend the full implications of what they faced. "Perhaps, Charles," Evangeline replied gently, "but if we do, it will be to help ensure that other children can grow up safely and happily just as you have." "Will you come back?" Charles asked, with the practical concern that characterized children's approach to uncertainty. "Always," Alexander assured him with absolute conviction. "No matter what adventures we may face, we will always come back to you." As Colonel von Habsburg departed to finalize arrangements for their Frankfurt protection detail, and Charles returned to his games in the garden, Prince Alexander and Princess Evangeline found themselves contemplating another mission that would test their skills, their courage, and their partnership. "Are you ready for another diplomatic adventure with mortal stakes?" Alexander asked, taking her hand with the same reverence he had shown since first carrying her unconscious form to safety. "With you," Evangeline replied, "I'm ready for whatever challenges await us. We've proven that we work well together under pressure." Their kiss was witnessed by the portrait of Emperor Franz Joseph that dominated their sitting room, but neither royal observer nor imperial obligations could diminish the love that had grown from rescue into partnership, and from partnership into the kind of marriage that made both parties stronger than either could be alone. The unconscious woman Prince Alexander had taken in his arms during a bitter winter storm had become his equal partner in serving causes greater than themselves. The stranger who had saved her life had proven himself worthy of complete trust and love that would last a lifetime. Together, they would face whatever new dangers awaited them in Frankfurt, secure in the knowledge that some bonds were strong enough to survive any test, and that some adventures were worth risking everything to complete successfully. Their son would grow up hearing stories of their courage, but more importantly, he would grow up experiencing the reality of parents whose love for each other and commitment to worthy causes provided security that no amount of danger could truly threaten. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next story.